Today I'm having a look at OpenAI's new agent builder. This was released a few weeks ago. It's pretty cool. You can create some really interesting agents. I've been messing around with it, seeing what it's capable of, and building a few agents of my own. And I want to give you kind of a quick demo / tutorial and then share with you my thoughts because while it is really interesting, there are a lot of limitations that I don't see many people talking about. Anyways, let's dive into it and have a look at the agent builder. So this is the interface for the new agent builder. Looks like this. I just have an example agent that I was working on previously up on screen here. And you can see that you have all of these different blocks, kind of like Scratch or like a drag and drop editor. And you can connect these together kind of just by dragging them through. You can click in, you can view all of the different options. And they have things like MCP connectors where you can connect directly to, Google Drive or Shopify, or you can bring in your own MCP server like this. Now, while that's pretty cool, it is fairly limited in terms of the external connections right now, but regardless, you can still create some pretty interesting flows like the one that I have right here. Now, I'm going to get into this flow. I'm going to show you an example of an agent that I've built and kind of how to do that and how to connect the different blocks. However, I want to quickly go over a lot of the things that OpenAI has released recently because it wasn't just this agent builder. Now, this is the original announcement back on October 6th, about a month from when I'm filming this video, and you can see that they actually were introducing AgentKit. Now, I guess that's what they're calling all of these kind of tools combined together. So, for example, that includes the agent builder, the connector registry, and then ChatKit, which is kind of, I guess, like an add-on to the agent builder, which allows you to use these interesting widgets. So you can have like forms, displays, list views, whatever. You can actually make your own widgets so you can display the data coming back from your agent in kind of a prettier, more usable way. Now, what's worth noting here is that before this release, OpenAI had the Responses API as well as the Agents SDK, which was a more developer kind of centric way of building AI agents and communicating with OpenAI. You've probably used it or seen it used before, and this is just adding tools that make it easier to build those agents. Now, with that said, there's a lot of moving pieces here. There's a lot of tools that OpenAI now has. And to be honest, I'm pretty confused by all of the ones that they have and how they work together. A lot of their documentation is currently not working or not up to date. I read through a lot of it before preparing for this video. So while all of this stuff is cool, it is still very early days. And I hope that they fix it soon because there's a lot of stuff I wanted to do that I just couldn't figure out how to do in a relatively short period of time because of how confusing some of these tools are. Anyways, that's kind of the new release. I'll also just quickly show you that ChatKit is kind of this more developer focused, add-on to this agent builder. So while you can build your custom agent and you can mess around with it in the browser and you don't really need to know how to code, if you want to use something like ChatKit and have these really fancy widgets, which I'll show you in a second, you do need to have a little bit of developer experience here and embed these directly in your front end with some kind of flow like this. Again, I'll have a look at that in a second, but just letting you know that while it seems cool with the agent builder, if you really want this to work kind of like in a production setting, you definitely need to know how to code, and there is a lot of configuration and setup that is not that easy to do. And just to give you a quick idea of what I mean here, if I go to the ChatKit Python SDK, you can see it doesn't even have a README file here. It just has this like random Apache license that we're having a look at. Pretty much a brand new repo with like kind of no activity and nothing going on. And this is what they're expecting you to look at to learn how to use the SDK. So yeah, it's, early days here for a lot of the developer or more advanced tools. Anyways, let's go back into the agent builder. Let me show you this agent that I built and kind of how you could replicate the same. And you'll notice here that OpenAI is really pushing towards building kind of agentic tools and allowing developers to build AI agents. And that's because as we advance more with AI, it's a lot less about just LLMs and how well they can reason, but more so about the actions that they can actually take. Now, that's exactly where today's sponsor as well comes in, and that's Rube.app. Now, think of Rube as your AI's chief of staff. Not just a note taker, but a command center. Once you connect it, Rube sits inside of your existing AI tools, whether you're using ChatGPT, Claude, Cursor, or even VS Code. And it gives them the power to use real apps securely and autonomously. Now look here, I can connect this directly inside of ChatGPT. It also works inside of the agent builder, and it's built by Composio. And it acts as a universal action layer across more than 600 applications, so things like Gmail, Notion, Slack, Salesforce, even your calendar. You just authenticate one time, and from then on, your AI can execute full workflows in plain English. So instead of prompting something like summarize my emails, you can go all the way. Find all unread emails from the past week, summarize the key points in Notion, and message my team on Slack if any need follow-up. Rube automatically handles the right tool connections, authenticates securely, and executes each step in the optimal order, all within your chat. It also has memory, so that means it learns how you work, who to ping, how you name things, when you prefer summaries, etc. Now, it's the first really unified action layer that I've seen that actually feels like a natural extension of your AI. It's free right now while it's in beta, so if you want to turn your LLM into something that can actually do things, go try it out at the link in the description. Anyways, let's get back into it here and have a look at these agents that you can build with the agent builder. Okay, so in terms of the agent builder, let me give you a demo of one of the ones that I've built so far so you can see kind of what's possible, and then we'll go into a blank flow and I'll show you kind of the basics of connecting and some of the limitations that it does have. So what I'll do is I'll just press on preview right here, and from here I'm able to test my workflow. So the flow that I set up here is that I want to use multiple agents to help me generate an outline for a YouTube video. So my idea is that first I want to generate kind of like a viral YouTube video title. I want to select which title that I want to generate the outline for, and then I want to have the model go ahead and generate a full outline and let me revise it based on my feedback. So you can see that that's kind of everything that's happening here. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just tell it, I want to generate a YouTube video for OpenAI's new AI agent builder. Okay, so I just tell it that, and then we can actually watch it run through this flow, goes into the if statement, goes here to the video title generator, and then starts generating our titles. Now we just got the output, but you'll notice here that it actually used a tool that I gave it. So it was searching the web, kind of looking for information on the OpenAI agent builder. And then what it did is it generated a bunch of titles in this JSON format and displayed it using one of the new chat widgets. Now this widget that you see here comes from AgentKit. Again, we'll talk about it in a second, but that's how I'm able to display this in kind of a nice format. Unfortunately, pressing on these doesn't work directly inside of the preview. In order to interact with the widgets, you need to connect this to your own backend server and set up honestly quite a bit of code so that you can actually track the state and kind of register the events and what are being pressed with these various widgets. But regardless, what I can do now is pick one of these. So maybe something like I built 3 agents, right? And then I can approve this. So it says, would you like to select one of these titles or do you want to try again? If I press try again, then we can generate more titles. If not, I'll press approve, and then it's going to wait for me to actually select the title that I want. So now I can just paste in the title. I built 3 agents with AgentKit. You'll see now that in this if statement, it's going to go to this next agent where it tries to parse out the title from the text that I provided. And then what it starts to do is ask, okay, do you want to generate, an outline for this video? So in this case, 3 agents. I'm going to go ahead and press on approve for that. And then what it's going to do is start generating this outline for me. Now, the way you set up the flows here is not super intuitive. And to be honest, I wish they had a lot more blocks and options because, for example, I can't just press on one of these things and have it be selected. So the only way I can kind of like select an option from my agent if I'm using this type of mode where I'm not trying to write a bunch of custom code is if I type it in, right? Which is why I need to kind of do this repeated step of typing in this title when really I should be able to just like press it and have the outline generate. So there's a few weird things like that you'll notice with the kind of flow as we start building one. But you'll see that what it's done now is generated this outline for me. So 12 to 14 minutes, blah, 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 kind of gives me the outline of the video. And then if I want, I can start chatting with it and revising the outline. And if that's the case, we would go into kind of this top loop up here because of how I've set up the if statements. Now, the interesting thing about this agent builder is that it does allow you to persist state. So you'll notice that I have these kind of set state blocks here where anytime I do something or make a decision, I can change the state, which then will adjust what's going to happen in the next run. So for example, we go and we generate a title and then I set the state saying, okay, we've already generated a bunch of title ideas. Then when we select a title, I set the state to indicate what title we've selected. And when I generate an outline, I save that outline in the state. By having that different state, I'm now able to redirect the agent to go into different paths and kind of use different AI agents so that it can do something different based on the current step that we're on in this flow. Now, a lot of other AI agent builders actually do this a lot better, in my opinion, but at least for a first stab at, OpenAI's agent builder, this is pretty good, and the state is very useful because it's persisted. Anyways, that's just a quick example of something that I personally built here in the agent builder when I was kind of learning this and messing around with it. Now, what I want to do is get into a blank flow and kind of show you how you can create your own, go through some of the blocks, and talk about how to connect them because it's not extremely intuitive. So if you go into the agent builder, you can just do that by searching, agent builder, OpenAI. And if you have an account, you're able to sign in and access it right here. You'll notice that kind of in the main window, you actually have a bunch of different options. So you now have stuff for example, creating audio, right? Or getting text to speech. You can do image generation here. I haven't messed with that too much. You can have different assistants, which work quite a bit different than the agent flow there. You can view your usage. These do use a lot of tokens, so just be careful. In my case, I think I used like $10 the other day messing around with it. You can view your logs, your storage, batches, all of that kind of stuff. And something interesting here is that while the agent builder does support vector search, so it allows you to actually search through vector databases and find information, in order to do that, you need to use a built-in vector search with OpenAI. So you would have to create your own vector store or upload your own files here to be able to pull that data in directly natively in the agent builder. Now you can do this from code, which I'll show you in a second, but it is obviously easier in this kind of flow. So if you come to the agent builder, you'll see that there's a bunch of different templates. You can have a look at them. I don't find them that useful, to be honest with you. So what I've been doing is just creating a new empty agent and kind of going from here. So now that I've made a new agent, I'll just build like a quick flow and show you kind of how to connect it and some of the options that are worth going over. But also note that you can use this directly from the agent's SDK. So for example, you can actually just copy all of the code right here. And this is a kind of text-based representation of the agent that you've built. So you see we have, a new agent. We have a workflow. In order to run the workflow, we keep track of the conversation history, and then we run the agent. And if I were to go here and add like another kind of, connection, and then we go up here to code and we look at the agent's SDK, you'll see it automatically adds the code for the guardrail. So if you want to do something more advanced, you can do that by going directly into the code and modifying that or just running it natively with the SDKs on your own computer. Again, that's going to take a lot longer, but you can do that. Now, you also have the option here of embedding this using AgentKit. This is a little bit easier than running all of the code here. What this allows you to do is essentially rely on OpenAI's servers to kind of host your agent. And what you can do is you can embed kind of the chat window and all of the widgets directly on your own front end. And then you can essentially send the request to the OpenAI backend, deal with the agent, and then get all of the feedback on your front end. Like I said before, it does require a little bit of setup there, but this allows you to have a lot more customization and to actually interact with the widgets and create some more complex flows. If you guys want a full tutorial on this aimed at developers, I'm happy to do that in the future, so just let me know. But I wanted to just let you know that it does have these features and you can get more advanced as a developer if you want to. You're not limited just to this kind of visual flow builder. Anyways, let's start building something quite simple. So if we start going through some of the nodes, you'll notice that you always need to start with a start node. Now from this start node, you're able to have various state variables and you can define them at the beginning or you can leave them undefined. So for example, we could have something like the user's name, right? And we can just leave that as an undefined value to begin. We can have an object, we can have a list, and with this state, because it persists between the different runs of the agent, you can create some more complex flows where you, for example, like ask the user for their name. After you get their name, you ask them, what they want to order, something along those lines. So to show you an example of that flow, we can have some agent right here. We can call this like name collection. From here, what we're able to do is give it a system prompt. So that's what this instruction is right here. And we can say something like, you need to, let's say, ask a user for their name, find their name, and return it. If there is no name, then return null or something, okay? Great, so you can give it kind of the system prompt explaining what it needs to do. If you want to add context to this prompt, you can directly do that by just passing in the context. Now, what I suggest doing is keeping this as the instruction prompt and then pressing this plus button here, which gives you the user prompt. So this one is the instructions. Then from here, you can add an assistant or a user prompt. So here, what we can do is just add the context, which is this. So this is from the start node, whatever the user typed in, the workflow.input as text. And now what will happen is it will read through this message, use these instructions, try to pull out the name. Now from here, you can choose things like if you want to include this in the chat history, you can of course pick your model. You can just leave it on GPT-5. You can put the amount of reasoning that it should do, especially if it needs to plan like a larger task. In this case, it's minimal because we just want to get the name. And then if you want, you can directly add tools here. So in terms of adding tools to the agent here, this really only works well if you're going to run this in your own environment and you're going to have your own backend setup. The way that the tool calls work is that if you use a function, for example, you have to write in the definition for how this function should be called, and then the agent will essentially generate a tool call that you would need to manually handle yourself on the backend. So if I just generate something like, tool that gets weather, or something, so you can just generate it with AI, it will create this kind of tool spec for us here, but it won't actually perform the action for that tool. So if you have a look at this spec here, we define what the tool call should look like and how this function should be called. But if the model generates a tool call, we don't know what the actual function is, right, for getting the weather. So we would have to actually implement that ourselves on our server to actually get the weather and then return that back to the model. So while it's interesting, it does require a lot of kind of developer intervention. So if you want to use some of those tools, keep that in mind. This requires you to actually go into the code, write the tool yourself, and kind of intercept the tool call from the model and then handle that. Now, if you want to use, for example, a client tool, same thing, you can write a client tool, and in this case, it will be triggered directly on your front end, whereas the other tools are going to be triggered on your back end if you're hosting this agent. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff here. I won't go into all of the settings, but this so far should collect the name. And then what we can do is we can change the output format. So for the output format, we have a few options. Text is the default. We also have JSON and widget. Now, this is extremely useful because a lot of times you want these models to return something structured that's consistent. So in our case, we just want it to return a name. So what we can do is we can have output format, which is JSON, and we can go here and define the schema that we want it to return. So we can go to add property here, and we can do something like name, and then we can give a description and say the name the user entered, like that, right? And then we can go to another property, and we can do something like a Boolean and say name found, and we'll say if a name was detected. So now what will happen, if we spell this correctly, is the model will return only this information to us. So it will give us an object that contains this name field and this name found field, and we can then use that to kind of figure out what to do next in our flow. So I'm going to update this here. We now have the response schema, and what we could do now is we could go into something like an if statement, right? So I can now put this into an if statement, and I can start writing some conditions. So I can do something like if, and we'll have the case. So for the case name, we'll say name found. And then the condition is we can look at the output that came from this agent. We can look, for example, if the name was found. So we can say if the name was found was equal to true, like that, then we can do something. And then we can have another case, which is an else if, or we can just leave it as else. So here we're going to say if the name was found, then what we can do is we can go into maybe another agent and we can ask the user to do something. Otherwise, we could just end, right? And we can bring in this end node. So if we put in the end node, we'll just immediately terminate it right there. Otherwise, we can go into this agent and we'll just say something like answer the user's question and always, let's see, like this, always refer to them by name. And then we're going to put the name in here so we can add the context, which is their name. Perfect. And then that's kind of all that we need. And then what we could do after this is we can go and we can end. So that's a very simple flow. If you want to test the flow, you can go to the preview and you can say something like, hey, how are you? My name is Tim. Okay, so let's wait for this to run and let's see what happens. So we're going into the name collection. It says the name is Tim, the name was found. And then we go into the if statement, we go into this agent. And then from the agent here, it says, hi, Tim, I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How can I help you today? So it didn't prompt us here to actually type something in again. It just went directly into this agent and kind of executed that instruction. And that's the thing that I don't really like about this is that I can't kind of enter another text string later on. I need to restart the flow in order to do that. So because of this limitation where you can't really provide new input in the middle of the flow, it means that you need to build these agents in a certain way so that they can kind of run again from the beginning, but go down a separate path based on the current state. Now, this is really only a limitation when you're doing it inside of the agent builder like I am right here. If you use custom code, then you can inject current state by using things like widgets, which again, I keep saying, but I will show you in a minute. But for now, let me show you the pattern that I've been using so that this agent actually makes sense. Because the idea is we want to ask the user, okay, like what's your name? And then we want to use their name throughout the rest of the flow in future conversation. So what we have right now doesn't really make sense because we ask the user their name, but then if they don't have any question in that text, when we go to this next agent, it doesn't really do anything for us. So we need to move things around a little bit where rather than us kind of doing this if else right now, we actually do it at the beginning. So let me just kind of disconnect these agents here. And we're going to put the if like this, and we're going to pretty much just change everything. So essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to start by adding some state. So if we go to start, we have the name, right? Okay, so that's good. So the state's already there. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, if the, and this is going to be name. So we're going to say if the state.name does not equal null, which means it's not empty essentially. So we have some name. That means we found the name. So if we found the name, we're going to connect it to this agent like this. Otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to go to this name collection agent. And then after the agent collects the name, we're going to use this set state block, where in the set state, we're going to say that we want to assign to the variable name. And what we want to assign is the name like this. Okay, so we're going to say, all right, we go to the name collection agent, we get the name. If there is some name, right, we assign that as the string. Okay, and then we can go to end. Now, there's other ways that we can do this that makes it actually work a little bit better. So in fact, let's change this a bit just so I can show you how this works. So rather than just storing the name, we're also going to have a Boolean, and we'll say name found like that. And by default, we can make this equal to false. So now in our if, we can actually make this a little bit more clear. And rather than state.name, we can say name underscore found like that. So we can say if the name.found is true, then what we're going to do is go to this agent right here where we'll create the user. Otherwise, what we can do is go here and then we can set state, and we can set multiple things. We can set the name, as well as we can set if the name is found, and we can assign this the value of true. Okay, so we just have two sets here inside of this set state, and then we end, and then here, let's make sure the name is correct. It is. So now we have the if else at the beginning. So if we go and we preview and say, hey, my name is Tim. Okay, and just wait 1 second. And now you saw we went into the name collection where it says, okay, you know, the name is Tim, the name found is true. Now if I type like, hey, how are you? We should see that we go into this top agent here, which we do because the name state was found and was already set. So that's kind of how we do this with the state. So now we get the response from the agent where it asks us how it can help us. So that's kind of the pattern that you're typically going to use, is you're going to set the state, and then here you'll check for the state at the beginning, and then you can go down a different path if that's the flow that you want to follow. Now, where this gets even more interesting is when you can start integrating widgets. So for example, you saw that when we collect the kind of name, it doesn't really give us any output, right? What it does is it gives us this JSON, but it's showing that JSON in the chat, which doesn't really look very nice. So what we can do is we can actually just uncheck this, so we're no longer displaying the response in the chat. And then what we can do is we can kind of add another agent in here where we can maybe greet the user before we move them to the next stage. So we can just connect another agent. For this agent, we can just call this greeter or something. I'm going to say greet the user with the name. Okay, and then we're going to add the context, which is name, and a random fact. Okay, so now we can actually just output some text and we can see that. However, if we want, we can make this even more interesting by integrating what's called a widget. So rather than going output format to JSON or text, we can use widget, which comes from AgentKit. Now, if we select widget here, what we're able to do is add a widget. And in order to add a widget, we need to create one. So I'm going to go to this create button right here, and it brings me to this new page, which is called the widget builder. Now, from the widget builder, we can look at existing widgets. You can see these are examples of like chat widgets, which is a way to return data in kind of a nice format. So you can see that we have like this weather format, right? We have this date format or calendar format. So what we're able to do is create these custom widgets, tell the model, hey, we want to output the text in this widget format, and the model automatically returns data that can populate these widgets. So for example, here's a widget that I actually made. It's like this kind of YouTube outline widget. I'm not using it right now, but it's one that I set up. We have this suggested videos widget. You already saw this in the first example. So you can make these widgets whatever you want. Now, there's also existing components that you can use to kind of build these widgets out. You can style them, you can have charts. But what's really interesting is that you can just use AI to make the widget. So for example, I can just ask something like, I want a widget that displays what the user's name is and a random fact. It should be colorful and fun. Okay, so I'm going to go here and press enter, and then it will just generate a widget for us, which we can download, upload back into the agent builder, and then we can output text in that widget format. Okay, so it's been a minute. You can see here that it's now generated a widget. We have like a dark theme one as well as a light theme one. And what we're able to do is see the schema for the widget, which is the information that our model would need to pass in order to generate this widget. This is the default information, sorry, this is the schema, my bad. And you can see what it looks like, right? So this is the code, and then this is the widget itself. Now what you're able to do here is simply download the widget. So you can just press download. I'm gonna save it into my widgets here. And then what we can do is go back to the agent builder, and we can simply upload it. So I'll go to widgets, I'll select the widget that I created. It shows us what it looks like. We can view the code for it. And now what we'll do is close. And now if we run our flow, we should be able to see this widget. So I'm going to say, hey, my name is Tim. Notice, by the way, you can also see the state variables here on the first run, and you can modify those. And I'm going to press enter. So you can see it now greets us. It says, hi, Tim. It says, here's a fun fact. And then it gives us a random fun fact. And if we say, what is the weather or something? The weather today. Okay, and we just go ahead and press enter. It should now go into the other agent because it already has our name, and then it should give us the answer. So let's give this a second. It's reasoning, blah, 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 looking up the weather, and says, I can help you with that. You know, tell me the zip code, whatever. Okay. Anyways, there you go. That is a simple example of building the agent. Now, of course, there's a lot of other tools that I didn't yet go into, right? For example, we have user approval. With the user approval, it's pretty straightforward. It just allows the user to either do approve or reject. You cannot change the name of these buttons. That's it. So you can just have one flow that you go off of if you want to approve something, one that you go off of if you want to reject something. And this is kind of the one way that the user can intervene in kind of the middle of the flow. But that's pretty much it. Let me just delete this one. You also have the while loop. This allows you to keep looping based on some condition, as you can see here. However, this is pretty tricky to use, so I wouldn't suggest it unless you really need that flow. You have notes, right? So you can just put a note and says, you know, check this, whatever, right? If you want to notify kind of what's going on in there. And then you have the file search. This only works inside of a vector ID created with OpenAI. So you can create your own vector store, upload data in there, and then search for results. But again, you need to do that directly in OpenAI, which makes it just not that useful. You have guardrails. What guardrails allows you to do is kind of sanitize text before it goes through your flow. So we can make sure there's no identifiable information. We can check for moderation, jailbreaks, hallucinations, etc. We can go in here and kind of add all of this different information and change all of the settings here so that we can kind of make sure that our agent is safe and it's not allowing users to try to hack it or, you know, ask for things that they shouldn't be asking for. And to do that, you would just connect that directly to the start node. So let's just delete this, right? And then the guardrail can go into the next flow. And from here, you can actually just have it kind of quit immediately, right? So for example, if we do this and then we fail, we can just go directly to an end block where now we won't go through the rest of the flow because the guardrails failed. So that's a pretty cool feature. That's interesting that they added that. And then you have MCP. Now for MCP, you can natively connect to some of these tools like Gmail, Google Calendar, Google Drive, etc. However, when you do this, it's not very easy to connect. So if you press this button that says Get Access Token, it brings you this crazy page where you essentially need to do this kind of manual setup where you authorize the API to access a certain set of features, and then you need to exchange this token for this access token and then provide this in here, which expires in a few days. And overall, it is not very friendly, which is why I did not show it in this video. Now, same thing for some of the other connections, PayPal, etc. You need all these access tokens, which are not easy to access. And then you have the server where you can, put in a server like the Notion MCP server, for example. However, the only way that this authentication works is using either custom headers or an access token, an API key, and it doesn't support an OAuth flow, which is how most of these MCP servers authenticate. So I'm not going to dive into this too much, but essentially, yes, you can add MCP servers here, but it only works if they're an HTTP MCP server, and if they do authentication using some kind of API key or custom header, not if they use an OAuth flow, which now is kind of standard, which is very unfortunate because if they did implement the OAuth flow, which means like you can kind of sign in and it will grab the token for you, then it would make this a lot more useful. But all of the MCP servers that I wanted to use, I just cannot use from this agent builder tool because of how they want the connection to be handled, which is quite unfortunate. Now that's pretty much it. There are a few other interesting tools. For example, like you can evaluate your agent and you can test it with multiple different, kind of flows here. You can see how long it takes to run inside of these different steps. You can actually have a grader. It's funny, you can use like a GPT model to grade your own GPT models and you can see how well that's performing. And if you get outside of these workflows here, you can go in and you can actually look at, for example, fine tuning, where you can fine tune models, and you can have this evaluation where you can evaluate different kind of data sets in your agents. So you can actually name a new data set, right? And then you can connect this to an agent and you can run through and test how it performs on those different data sets. Pretty cool. They added a lot of interesting stuff here, but to be honest, it only becomes useful if you're going to actually integrate this with your code. So while, yeah, we can build these cool agents, we can mess around with them in the preview window. If you want any interactability, if you want to be able to pause the flow, if you want to change the state dynamically, you are going to need to write some code to do that. Because for example, if we go back to the widget builder, right, and we just go to the gallery, you'll see that all of these widgets have like buttons like add to calendar, discard. We have forms, right? Where we can enter all of this data. But this only works, and we can only use these kind of inputs if we connect this to our own backend, which is not made that clear by OpenAI and is really limiting when you're using the agent builder in this kind of, UI mode, as opposed to, if I can go back to it, the code mode. So I guess I got out of it, but that's fine. Anyways, I think with that said, guys, I'm going to wrap up the video for now. I wanted to give a quick tutorial, show you some of the limitations as well as the capabilities of this tool. Overall, I think it's really cool. I think OpenAI has the possibility to make this the best agent builder out there. Right now, I would say that it's pretty limiting, especially from a drag and drop perspective. If you want full control here, you do need to write some code and integrate it. And I am planning on doing that in the future, and making a full tutorial on how to do that. So if you're interested in that type of video, leave a comment down below and let me know. And I'm sure I'll be covering this more on the channel in the future. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.